Olivia's threat was effective and quickly quieted the crowd. After the outburst, her command was even more effective. Everyone dealt with the swarm in an orderly manner. When those who hadn't agreed to fight saw the others happily eating their meals, they quickly became excited and asked to join the defense. There was a reasonable amount of time between the swarm attacks, with a wave of bugs appearing every 10 minutes. There were many insects coming through the shield, but they were no match for the Dawn Alliance. With the promise of meat and rice, the people responded with unprecedented enthusiasm. Those who had been hungry for days felt as though they had been injected with energy. They were willing to risk giant bugs for even one bite of a cooked meal. When it was time to change shifts, everyone made the best use of their time and began to practice. They understood that the stronger they were, the easier it would be to kill the bugs. As everyone trained, they gradually formed teams and sparred with each other. Most teams were made up of 12 people each. When they had their turn at the wall, they divided the spoils of war equally and worked together to improve. Some killed the insects, and others used the corpses of the insects to buy food or weapons for the group. Charles found he had to do very little for several hours. He served the meal and later handed the job to Lena, Hugh, and a few others. His main task was forging artifacts. His ancient book contained all kinds of unorthodox knowledge. Due to the living environment in his previous life, he hadn't had much time to study. Instead, he had generally focused on improving his strength. But now that he had the time to dedicate to reading, he spent a lot of time and effort refining weapons. He used the mouth parts and strong limbs of bugs, as well as zombie and animal bones, in the creation of blades and daggers. When he combined the weapons with the simple power of Thunder Spell Array, they became so incomparably sharp that almost no creature's hide could withstand them. However, the daggers were expensive. Making them required 5 medicinal crystal cores. If people wanted to buy one, they had to give Charles 15 dead bugs. Most of the teams banded together to make the purchases. They used the whole team's spoils to pay for a dagger, which increased their collective efficiency at killing bugs and enabled them to produce daggers for other members. "These things cut through bugs like butter," someone said gleefully. Once the daggers' efficiency became apparent, demand for them increased. Thus, everyone's desire to kill the insects became even stronger. Some of the more daring and confident teams even requested to leave the protective shield to kill the insects faster. Olivia hesitantly granted their request. Some of the teams returned with a full load, but many didn't come back at all. Killing the bugs inside the protective shield was one thing, but it was another to venture beyond the wall. Some people were willing to risk it, but many of them paid the price with their lives. After more than 100 people had been lost, ideas of leaving the fortress slowly faded from most people's minds. After all, they thought, we have a safe environment with support and warm food to replenish our stamina. Why would we take the risk? Most of them were eager to improve their accuracy, but they were also satisfied with the rate of progress they were making. If they wanted to go out and kill bugs, they decided they could wait until they had better equipment. Despite the risks, there were also some teams that returned with a full load of insect bodies. They exchanged these for Charles's specially made chain armor. He had developed an armor from the strongest parts of the bugs, and his protective capabilities were outstanding. Someone demonstrated its strength by having their friend try and stab him with a knife. The blow was useless, and the attacker was thrown off balance. Everyone wanted one. "I need one of these," the man who had attacked his friend said. "How much credit do I need for one?" 180 Tier 1 medicinal crystal cores, or 6 Tier 3 medicinal crystal cores, his friend replied. Although they were envious of the armor's outstanding defensive properties, the high price made most people wince. But they knew that having armor would raise the entire squad's fighting capabilities. Some ambitious teams were prepared to buy armor from Charles at any cost to ensure all their members were fully armed. One group even approached him and asked whether he would accept 2 bags of rice in exchange for some weapons. They knew the value of food was higher, but they reasoned that if they obtained enough powerful weapons, they could accumulate wealth faster. They would quickly earn back the 2 bags of rice. Besides, they thought, their rice was uncooked, and only Charles had the ability to cook it and add meat. Uncooked rice was of little use to them. Charles smiled encouragingly. "Of course you can," he said. I'm open to negotiation. He provided them with a few long spears and swords made from zombie bones, as well as a long blade of refined metal. He wasn't stingy, and he ensured he gave them all a fair return for their precious rice. The members of the team tested out their new weapons and gave Charles satisfied smiles. They praised his workmanship, and Charles was glad they were happy. Alice was present for the trade, and she narrowed her eyes at him when she saw him profiteering. But when he gave her 30 crystal cores, she warmed up considerably. I'm not going to do this often, Charles assured her. They're just excited because the stuff is new. He laughed at himself. He felt like a merchant, but he had no intention of staying in business for long. Accumulating too much wealth during the post-apocalyptic era could be dangerous. Without the strength to protect assets, it was easy for people to take them by any means they could. Although Charles was pleased with his remuneration, he reminded himself not to get carried away. He had survived so long by being careful, and he wasn't about to change his tactics now. Of course, such large-scale trading opportunities didn't happen often, so he had no need to worry. Suddenly, an explosion occurred a mile or so from the fortress. It took many people by surprise and caused a minor panic. The military's phone rang, and one of the soldiers answered. Once he hung up the call, he approached Charles anxiously. The military camp has reported a powerful Crawler clan attack led by the Hive's queen. They barely managed to repel it with rocket launchers. They called to say the clan has retreated in our direction. During the 3 days Charles had been unconscious, Miranda had never left his side. Even when he had woken up, she had never been far from him. Instead, she'd stayed in the room next to his and had left her door ajar. If anyone entered that room, or if Charles left it, Miranda would know about it. She had told herself she needed to protect him, but now she wondered if there were other feelings involved. At that moment, she could sense a shift in the energy coming from Charles's room. She suddenly became alert and ran to him. Even if it turned out to be nothing, she would rather face an awkward misunderstanding than learn that something bad had happened to him, and she hadn't been there to help. When she entered the room, the first thing she saw was Charles doubled over, his face contorted in pain. He was clenching his teeth and clutching the bedsheet with his left hand. Miranda rushed to him and put her arm around his shoulders. "I'm here," she said. "You're okay. This will pass." She felt a twinge in her heart to see him like this. Has he been suffering this much all this time and only pretending to be strong? She wondered. Then again, how could such an important leader show weakness to his followers? It doesn't matter how much pain he's feeling. He still has to talk and laugh along like it's nothing. Only when he's alone can he let it all out and fully give in to the pain he's been holding in. She didn't know how to comfort him other than to repeat what she had already said. "I'm here. You're okay." "I'm fine," he said through gritted teeth, turning away from her. Although this was the pain of cell regeneration, it hurt so badly that it felt more like losing a body part than regrowing one. Even having Miranda holding him didn't help the pain. "It's fine," she said. "It'll all be fine." She hadn't known what was causing him so much pain, but then her gaze fell to his right side. Where there had been no arm before, now a thin white limb had grown from his shoulder. It was pale, bloodless, and still somewhat shriveled, but before her eyes it was growing thicker, stronger, and pinker. Miranda was so shocked that she couldn't put a full sentence together. Your arm." She hadn't for a second believed that Charles had been speaking the truth when he had told her about the arm. But it had clearly started to regrow, recovering and lengthening in front of her. And if she hadn't fully grasped this, she wondered what else she had misunderstood. She didn't dare to move, afraid that she would disturb him. After a few minutes, he finally managed to recover. Although the arm was still as pale as a baby's, it had grown to its original length. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and stretched it out. Meanwhile, he could sense that his body had gone through some other changes within. Some of his soul energy gushed out from his energy center to nourish the arm. He reached out for the essence water he had prepared beforehand and drank it. His face recovered some of its color. He had known all along that the extreme cell regeneration he had demanded of his body would have a cost. To regrow his arm would take at least 10 years off his life. But this was a small matter. Aside from the fact that he knew how to recover some of his lost life force by absorbing it from other life forms. He came from a world where one would happily trade 10 years of life for a full meal. In that world, people would even eat zombie meat if it came to it. Just to recall that time in his past life sent a chill down his spine. Miranda watched this miracle unfolding in front of her, and she was so shocked that she couldn't speak. Charles had brought many surprises into her life, but she had never expected him to be capable of something like this. It called for her to reconsider what he was capable of. From now on, no matter how unlikely his promises, she would take him at his word. Nothing could surprise her after what she had seen. His body absorbed the essence water. He felt that, with his breakthrough, the water seemed to have replenished not only his soul energy, but also his body's vitality. The increase was slight and hard to detect, but he could just about feel it. It made him more certain than ever that the energy storage space really was capable of producing new life. Of course, he didn't mean that it could create life from nothing, but it could provide a space where he might plant seeds that would take root, germinate, thrive, and grow into food. If the storage space really could provide such an environment, he might no longer have to worry about providing food for himself and the others. In this era where resources were so scarce, he would have found a near infinite space in which to grow food. At this moment, though, he had other matters on his mind. Creating life is a power I thought only those who had reached the saint level possessed. But now, with the help of the storage space, maybe I already possess it. Maybe there are other abilities I already have that I thought you could only achieve when you got to that level. "Are you all right?" asked Miranda, seeing that he was deep in thought. He turned to her and noticed that she was very close. The air between them, what little there was, felt charged with electricity. He took her in his arms and said, "1 minute you're kissing me, the next you're trying to get as far from me as you can. What's really going on here?" He stroked her cheek with his newly grown hand. "What about Alice?" she asked. He pulled his hand away. He wasn't accustomed to sparing much thought for others' feelings, but her question had struck a chord. If they really spent this night together, how would they be able to live with themselves? But then she pushed him down onto the bed, and the doubts left his mind as quickly as they had arrived. "What are we doing?" Charles asked, stunned. But they were already undressing, giving in to the moment. "Let's not think about Alice tonight," Miranda whispered into his ear. That night, it was clearly going to be difficult to get any sleep. Miranda suddenly stood up. Her whole body trembled with anger. "I've seen too many people lose their humanity due to desperate situations," she said. "I don't want to see it happen to anyone else." She had always done her best to save people, even though it had been necessary for her to kill sometimes. Her conscience was clear, because she believed her actions had ultimately been for the greater good of her people. If eliminating bad people meant an increased chance of survival for the innocent, she saw it as her duty to follow through. Charles's words had made her wonder about the Alliance's motivations. It was inevitable that many people would die in the post-apocalyptic environment, but most of them had a single hope in their hearts, and that was to retain their humanity. When she had watched her people fighting side by side, killing monsters, grinning through mouthfuls of hot dinner, showing off their new weapons, snuggling up with their loved ones, and feeling happy about their survival, she realized that she was driven by hope too. She, Charles, and the others had given that to people, and that was what united them all. What she truly wanted to protect wasn't only human life, but human nature itself. Anthony raised his hand and said, "I'm in too. I know I've only been in contact with these people for a few hours, but I feel like I've fallen in love or something." "Me too," Zach said. "I feel at home here." "Count me in," Calvin said. "If possible, I want to try and preserve what we have here." Kevin smiled. "It's crazy, but I also want to protect them." Charles didn't say anything. He knew people frequently had changes of heart, but he wanted to instill loyalty in them. He wanted the people who fought with him to fight for each other and to keep each other safe. He considered that it might be difficult, but he wanted to try anyway. Alice looked at Charles with a soft expression. She whispered to him, "I don't think I've ever seen you look this hot. You were always cute, but there's something special about you now." Lena looked at her brother. She had a strange feeling in her heart, but even if he was a little different from how he had been before, everything that mattered was still the same. "Please be okay, Charles," she silently prayed. She didn't mind Charles's sudden battle-ready persona at all, but she did worry about his safety. Greg and the other soldiers were stunned that Charles and the others would fight to the death against such a terrifying monster. "I'll report to the higher-ups and fight alongside you all," Greg promised solemnly. Since they were preparing to fight, Charles naturally wanted as many people as possible to be fully armed. He handed a few confiscated submachine guns to some of the military personnel. "When the Hive Queen appears," he instructed them, "don't shoot it. Take out the sentries that are guarding it first. Take away its support and leave the battle to us." He passed the blood-drinking sword to Miranda. "This can only be used by you," he said. "When you get the chance, cut open the Queen." Miranda took the sword. She tapped the blade with her finger. With only a gentle touch, her finger bled. But she wasn't unhappy. Rather, she beamed and felt somewhat fond of the weapon. Charles explained, "This sword was forged using the bone spur from before. At that time, I couldn't figure out the refining method, but now it's ready. I want you to keep it with you." Miranda was touched. "But if you give this to me," she said, "what will you use to fight?" "I have a lot of skills," he replied. "When you're using the sword later, try not to attack for as long as possible. Save your energy until you have the chance to kill the Queen. When the time comes, use Thunderstrike." Miranda nodded and accepted the challenge. "I can't accept something so valuable permanently," she told him. "After I use it on the Queen, I'll return it to you." She was a woman of firm principles, and she felt strongly about returning possessions. Although she was no longer a teacher by profession, she still held tight to what she had always taught her students, to return people's property. Charles was slightly amused, and he shook his head in disbelief. "Let's wait until after the battle's over," he said, "and then we can argue about who gets to keep the sword." His expression suddenly changed. "It's here," he cried. He shouted to Olivia, "Quickly, evacuate the civilians in that direction." Olivia quickly tried to disperse the crowd in the direction he had indicated, but they didn't get the chance to move far. A huge figure, almost 7 feet tall, loomed above them in the night. Most insects were large, with proportional strength. When the Alliance members saw the huge insect, they couldn't help but shiver. If this bug's strength matched its height, they were in trouble. Behind the main insect was a large number of bugs, around half the height of a person. They flew toward the crowd. Zack was the first to attack. A long snake made of fire coiled around his body. It flicked its forked tongue and flew at the Hive Queen. But before the snake could reach its target, a black beetle suddenly threw itself in front of the Queen. It unfurled its wings and blocked the path of the fiery snake. There was a shriek as the snake was blown to pieces by the Queen's sentry. The bug itself remained unharmed. Zack's face turned pale. Although the snake attack wasn't necessarily his strongest move, he considered it as his best. The beetle had blocked it as though it were nothing, and that fact blew his mind. "The beetle specializes in restraining flames," Charles told him. "Don't panic. Just use the Hellfire to attack groups of them and focus on the bugs that can be easily burned." Most of the insects were afraid of fire, but the mutation process had created some exceptions. A few of the bugs, such as the one Zack had attacked, were even immune to it. Zack nodded. He summoned the Hellfire, and the dark blue flames burned the space around the Hive Queen. It raged among the insects, trying to set all of them alight in one fell swoop. The bugs struggled with all their might against the Hellfire, but many of their wings were burnt beyond repair. They struggled, unable to fly. Good. Seeing Zack's display of strength, one of the Alliance higher-ups, a long-haired young man, couldn't help but exclaim his admiration. The Dawn Alliance didn't have any fourth-tier paranormals, and those who witnessed Zack's power were suitably awed. "Don't cheer," Charles said in annoyance. "Just hurry up and attack the burnt bugs." The Dawn Alliance used their elemental powers to focus on the bugs that Zack had injured with his sea of fire. Zack's turret of Hellfire had destroyed many of the weaker bugs. But just as the Alliance members proceeded to finish them off, the Hive Queen let out an unpleasant, ear-piercing noise. A visible wave of sound appeared around the Queen, and while she screamed and the sound continued to roll, all the Hellfire weakened. Not only that, but all the attacks that had been launched by the Fire Element paranormals also lost their strength layer by layer, until they were effectively useless. The elemental paranormals continued to launch attacks on the swarm of bugs, but they were quickly blocked. Their confidence evaporated, and they cried out in surprise and fear. What sort of ability is that? It can extinguish flames with sound? Some of them had encountered monsters that were resistant to flames before. They'd even found ones whose bodies presented outstanding defense systems against it. However, the Hive Queen had physically extinguished the sea of flames. Spear of ice and snow. A water-type paranormal created a long spear made of ice and threw it in the direction of the Hive Queen. However, before the attack could reach it, the spear was bitten in two by a giant bug. "They're undefeatable!" cried the water paranormal. The faces of many paranormals turned pale. As superpower possessors who had awakened on their own, they were deeply proud. It cut them to the quick that their powers couldn't withstand a single blow from a giant bug. Resoluteness flashed in Miranda's eyes. She prepared to charge forward, but Charles pulled her back. "Why did you stop me?" she roared. "Don't you see? Elemental attacks are weak against them. Only melee attacks can damage them." She was no longer a novice fighter, and she knew that monsters that were immune to both elements and melee attacks were practically non-existent. Since these bugs appeared to be immune to the elements, it was time for the melee fighters to shine. "Of course I know," Charles replied. "But it's still too early to say that all elemental abilities have no effect on them. Alice, use your rain attack." Everyone was baffled. None of them could see the use for such a basic ability. Alice ignored the Alliance members' shared confusion. She conducted a storm above the insects' heads, and the bugs that had been flying toward them fell to the ground. When everyone saw the result of the rainstorm, they were collectively stunned. It was as if a door had opened in front of them. "Holy shit! A water-type power can do that?" someone cried. Water-type superpowers often came with the stereotype of being less powerful than the other elements. Of the elemental superpowers, water was considered the weakest. The fact that there was now a substantial benefit to water powers was a revelation. Miranda was impatient to have her turn. "The bugs are already injured," she thought. "If they can't attack us, what are we waiting for?" Although Charles had said he wanted her to wait to draw her sword until she could kill the Hive Queen, she thought that now was the best opportunity she had. Her reasoning was that she thought it best to take out the monster as quickly as possible in order to keep the Alliance members from sustaining significant casualties. "Quick, cover her!" When the water paranormals saw Miranda running in to attack, they fired one shot after another at the bugs in her path. A few close combat paranormals also stepped forward to finish off the bugs as they landed. Kevin emitted a colorless dragon energy that swept swiftly toward the bugs on the ground. The Hive Queen let out a strange cry that made people want to cover their ears. However, they all forced themselves to remain strong and endure it. The fighters gritted their teeth and used the weapons in their hands to destroy as many of the insects as possible. Thunder strike! Miranda rushed to the Hive Queen's side. The long sword in her hand released a brilliant white light and pierced the Queen's body, but the blade stopped halfway. The sharpness of the blood-drinking sword's blade was beyond measure, even for Charles. However, when faced with the Hive Queen's armor, it could barely pierce half of it. Seeing Miranda succeed in stabbing the terrifying monster, everyone cried out in excitement. "Don't celebrate," Charles scolded them again. He moved his fingers continuously. From the tip of each burst an array of weapons. Ice arrows, fire snakes, earth spikes, and wind blades flew out and slashed at the Hive Queen. He had originally used the extract amulets to deal with the Neal family, and he hadn't anticipated they would be of any use against the bugs. However, he decided that since they were faced with such a terrifying monster, it wasn't excessive to use whatever means he could to defeat it. Not only did he continuously release the extract amulet's power, but he decided to wake the lightning cadaver serpent on his arm too. A black python wound its way out of his arm, spitting blue lightning from its mouth. The lightning electrocuted all the bugs at the same time. "Stab the blade deeper," he shouted to Miranda. Miranda's extreme light was able to be wielded from a significant distance, but she still had to be closer to her target than a paranormal, and it was still close enough to be considered close combat. The Hive Queen let out its unnatural shriek, and countless bugs gushed from its vast mouth and engulfed Miranda's body. "Don't let them wrap silk around you," Charles shouted. But Miranda couldn't hear him. She let go of the sword briefly, and her hand emitted a white light. Then she hit the hilt of the sword with all her strength. With as much power as she could muster, she sunk the blade deeper into the Queen. Once the blood-drinking sword was buried 2/3 of the way into the Hive Queen, she raised her hand again. "Miranda, get out of there," Charles ordered. A water dragon burst from his hand and tried to bite the Hive Queen's body. The lightning cadaver serpent also took the opportunity to bite the Hive Queen's body, but its fangs couldn't penetrate the surface. Despite Charles's warning, Miranda kept at her work. As she held the blood-drinking sword, she felt it emit a surge of energy. It felt as though the Queen's energy was being absorbed. "The sword is devouring the monster's life force," she cried. "The longer it stays embedded, the weaker the Queen gets." Determination flashed in her eyes. Even the blood-drinking sword was unable to completely pierce through the Queen's exoskeleton. She knew that if the monster made it through the defensive line of the protective shield, the consequences for the Dawn Alliance would be unimaginable. The Hive Queen bellowed again, and its screech seemed louder than ever. Then, it ejected more bugs. This time, they managed to pierce Miranda's body. The moment Miranda was struck, Charles felt like his brain would explode. He didn't understand why she hadn't retreated. His mind repeated the attack over and over. He briefly wondered what the point of his continued existence was without her. Protecting the people he cared about was his purpose. "What do I do now?" he wondered desperately. "Why did I have to lose someone I so badly wanted to protect? Why did I ask her to do something so dangerous?" At that moment, rage filled his body. The power of thunder coursed wildly in his blood, almost bursting through his skin, and one extract amulet after another appeared at his fingertips. However, even an attack that was comparable to a 5th-rank superpower didn't cause too much damage to the Hive Queen. It only deepened the monster's injuries a little. Miranda's consciousness gradually began to fade. Somehow, the strange power emanating from the blood-drinking sword was allowing her to retain her grasp on life. "I'm not ready to go," she thought. "I know this place is dangerous and terrifying. I know that many people have already lost themselves and resorted to terrible means to survive. But I believe in people. This place still holds the hope for humanity." She felt her desire to save her friends course through her body. She recklessly poured her energy into the blood-drinking sword, willing the blade to absorb every ounce of her being. If she could only weaken the terrifying monster even a little, she knew it would help the Alliance. Even a Tier 4 paranormal was unable to cause decent damage, so she could only hope that empowering the sword would help turn the odds in their favor. A few paranormals who were harvesting the bodies of the Crawlers clan suddenly noticed a few strands of bug silk wrapped around them. They tried their best to remove the strands, but the more they did, the more strands seemed to appear. "What is this stuff?" cried one of the paranormals. When his arm came into contact with the strange silk, it began to shrivel at a rapid pace and then decompose. He made the quick decision to cut off the limb with a single slash. Blood spurted out, but Olivia was around to help. She used her light to seal the wound and healed it to the best of her abilities. Once she had saved the paranormal, she continued to her destination, which was Miranda's fallen body. "Miranda," she shouted, "come back." But her cousin seemed to be beyond her reach. The light in her eyes was dim. "Miranda!" Alice's eyes filled with a scarlet light, and she could feel that her healing powers were somehow amplified. She felt as though she had unlocked even more powerful abilities. Ice Dragon Descent. A 30-foot-long ice dragon appeared beside her and flew in the direction of the Hive Queen. The ice dragon spewed forth cold air and froze half of the Queen's body. Olivia seized the opportunity to pick up Miranda, and then she got both of them away from the monster in a flash, racing to Sylvia for help. "Quick!" she shouted anxiously. "Please save her. She's like my sister." Sylvia used a holy light technique to assess the extent of Miranda's wounds. "You'll be all right, Miranda," Olivia promised her cousin, clasping her hand tightly. But in her heart, she felt helpless. Sylvia felt Miranda's gradually disappearing life force, but she also sensed another force around it. She felt a brief glimmer of hope. "She's someone very important to Charles, isn't she?" she asked Olivia. "If she dies, he'll be beyond devastated." To Olivia's surprise, a pair of wings made from light appeared on Sylvia's back. A holy radiance enveloped the older woman's entire body. With a jolt, Olivia realized that she appeared to have turned into an angel. The power of the holy light enveloped Miranda's broken body, and a truly magical event occurred. Her face, which had been gradually losing its red complexion, began to regain its former luster. The despair that had welled inside Olivia's heart suddenly turned to hope. Tears welled in her eyes, and then they flowed down her face as though they would never stop. Through her blurred vision, she noticed that the hair of Sylvia's temples had turned white. "Are you all really going to watch the ladies right now?" a martial artist on the battlefield roared. "Kill the damn bugs!" The other martial artists, who had been staring at Sylvia's apparition as though transfixed, brought their attention back to their primary goal. But the sight seemed to have affected them deeply. "Kill these bugs," they chorused. "Charge! Fight this monster to the death!" All of them rushed at their terrifying enemy, disregarding everything else. The martial artist at the front had his throat pierced by a bug thread, but despite the pain, there was no fear in his eyes. Instead, the attack only served to encourage him. "Die, you scum!" he screamed. He used his remaining strength to plunge his dagger into the Hive Queen's eyes. The dagger hit its intended target, but it didn't leave so much as a cut. The brave martial artist knew he was about to die, but his resolve to protect the others remained resolutely in place until the end. "Kill it!" he cried. Even the people who were being evacuated stopped in their tracks. When they saw their comrades' bravery, they held their weapons high and rushed at the Hive Queen too. They ignored their own fear and used their weapons to cause as much damage to the insect as possible. None of them could say why they had decided to do it. Perhaps it was because they were inspired by the martial artist's bravery, or maybe it was a moment of hot-bloodedness. But the reason wasn't important. They all silently agreed that they would lay down their lives to take out the hellish creature in front of them. All thoughts of fear left them, and one single goal remained: kill the monster. "Are you all crazy?" Kevin asked. He sharply cut the bug silk strands one by one with a series of swift chops of his hand. He wanted to save as many people as possible, but the bugs' silk seemed endless. "It'd be great if someone could flip the world upside down so we could fight them on our level," he muttered. Against the impenetrable armor of the Hive Queen and the bugs' mobility in the air, he felt helpless. The ice dragon let out a final wail and fell to the ground. It had used up its remaining strength, but in the end, it was still unable to escape its fate. It was reduced to a pile of broken ice. The lightning cadaver serpent also let out a howl of pain as it fell to the ground. The wounds inflicted on it by the insect claws had been so deep that one of its bones was visible. The immense serpent, that had been undefeated in several battles, was no match against the sheer power of the Hive Queen. As it died, it turned around to look for its master. Charles's body was surrounded by black energy. It swirled around him as he approached the monstrous queen. Even a beast as fearsome as the lightning cadaver serpent looked apprehensive when it saw Charles in his current state. Its damaged body shrunk back a little in fear. As it did so, more of its black blood left its body. "All of you get out of the way," Charles commanded imperiously. He raised his right arm high. At first glance, it looked as though the limb itself had transformed into a sharp sword. The onlookers had to divert their eyes because the sight was physically painful to observe. "It's the innate sword energy," Kevin realized in horror. "No!" he cried. "Your body can't withstand that level of energy!" Charles's previous battle plans had all been relatively simple. In some battles, he hadn't even needed to utilize some of the maneuvers he had prepared. His previous enemies had been defeated with relative ease, which made him feel proud of himself as a leader. He didn't like being boastful, but it was hard for him to be otherwise when he recalled his victories. There had only ever been one thing that had frustrated him above all others, and that was his inability to break through to Tier 4. He didn't know how many Crawlers clan corpses he had refined, nor how many crystal cores he had absorbed. The size of the energy storage space in his body was far greater than peak Tier 3. However, despite this, he was unable to break through. In his previous life, breaking the barrier had been as easy as eating or drinking. However, in his new life, he felt the resistance of an invisible obstruction. As much as he tried to break it with his will, it remained immovable, making him feel more powerless with every subsequent try. He began to feel as though he was reaching into the sky for the moon. No matter how far he stretched, it was always slightly further away. He didn't know why he felt that way, and he often wondered whether he had made a mistake somewhere. But he didn't have time to think clearly, because there was a powerful enemy that he needed to deal with. He thought about Miranda, and then he put all of his focus on the Hive Queen. One after another, his people began to sacrifice themselves. Charles's heart, which he had thought to be as cold as ice, suddenly started to burn with passion. Seeing people give their lives without hesitation reminded him of his father in his previous life. He remembered how his Aunt Sue had sacrificed herself to save him from danger. He recalled the captain of the super squad, his teammates, and Elaine, who had taken her last breath in his arms. "Why did you save me?" he had asked her. "It'd be a pity if I didn't have someone to sacrifice my life for." Her voice echoed in his ears, as if it was yesterday. He had never seen a single trace of regret in her eyes. He doubted she had ever experienced a moment of it in her life. If we never do anything meaningful with our lives, then what's the point of coming into this world? He wondered. He suddenly felt a flicker of annoyance. If he could only reach the 4th level, he was sure defeating a mere hive queen would be a piece of cake. He wondered if he would ever be able to defeat higher-level monsters if he never broke through. So, he did what he believed many people resorted to in the face of disaster. He turned to spirituality. He thought of the innate sword energy. It was an unconventional martial arts move. Theoretically, the power of the innate sword energy was infinite. However, due to the limitations of a person's own strength and body, the physical form couldn't unleash the full power of the move. The energy in his body gathered into his right arm. He felt the sword energy in his body become stronger and sharper. A little stronger, he urged himself. He recklessly increased the power of the innate sword energy. He no longer cared about the limitations of his body. All he could focus on was finding enough strength to pierce the Hive Queen's exterior. He knew it was a long shot, and he thought that no matter how powerful the energy was, he would still be unable to defeat the beast. He also understood that once his sword energy slowed, it would also hinder his ability to improve. He approached the Hive Queen slowly. On his way, he felt as if he was separated from everything around him by an invisible force. It was as though his body had been torn apart, and every one of his blood vessels had been severed by the power of the sword energy. His consciousness gradually faded, and his vision began to blur. However, the figure of the Hive Queen strangely became even clearer in his perception. "Kill it," he heard himself think. "Kill it." He was filled with a strong sense of belief. All that was left in his mind was the thought of killing the queen. He raised his right hand high, and the sword energy in his arm was almost unbearable. "No!" he heard Kevin cry from somewhere far away. "Your body can't withstand that level of sword energy!" "I don't need to withstand it," he thought. "As long as this strike is powerful enough, it'll be enough." Resolution flashed through his mind, and his vision became clear. Time appeared to stop around him as he brought his arm down. Charles's sword energy descended, and it seemed to penetrate everything in its path. The Hive Queen's body was cut in half by the force, and then it started burning. Within moments, the queen was dead, but the sword energy was still alive. It had severed its target, but it still seemed to feel that it hadn't done enough. Charles aimed at the surrounding bugs, and every insect within miles was struck dead in an instant. "Charles!" Alice rushed to him anxiously. "I did it," Charles exclaimed. He gave her a rare, genuine smile. He had won countless battles, but never once had he felt as elated as he did in that moment. His body slowly fell to the ground. As he did, his right arm evaporated into a bloody mist, and dozens of wounds began to appear all over his body. "No!" Alice cried. "You can't die!" As she washed his wounds and desperately tried to encourage him to hang on, she felt a terror unlike anything she had ever known. "He can't survive this," she realized. Then she scolded herself. "No, he's exceptional. He has to wake up." Lena rushed over, but was careful not to touch him. She was afraid that if she did, her strength and emotions would overcome her, and her brother would be smashed into a million pieces. She felt powerless and helpless. Charles had always taught her to work hard to improve herself, even though she hated fighting. He had taught her how to survive in the world. She had learned quickly, but she had always felt that something was missing. At that moment, she blamed herself. "If only I'd been a little stronger," she thought. "If only I'd been able to help. If I wasn't so weak, perhaps my only brother wouldn't have had to risk his life." Kevin looked sadly between Lena and Charles. His extraordinary friend was about to lose his life on the battlefield. But then he noticed something flicker in Charles's eyes. His mouth was moving, but Kevin couldn't hear what he was trying to say. He looked up and felt his heart stop. A swarm of insects was rapidly approaching from around 12 miles away. Charles's incredible sword strike had disintegrated every bug for miles, but it had attracted even more. Lured by the smell of blood, the new attackers were even more frenzied than their predecessors. Kevin wondered frantically what to do now that their leader lay practically unconscious on the ground. Am I dead? Wondered Charles. He didn't know where he was or how he had got there. He could vaguely remember striking out at his enemy just before his sword had disappeared from his grip. If only I could start all over again, he thought. If I could go back, I could change everything. I could stop all this tragedy and make up for my mistakes. But nothing has worked out. He smiled bitterly. If only he were granted a second chance, he would be sure to make the most of it. But he had squandered his only chance, and it ended up here, wherever here was. Had it been worth it? He didn't know. But if I had to do it all over again, he thought, I wouldn't change a thing. In his heart of hearts, though, he knew this wasn't true. He was full of regret. I've let down the people closest to me, he thought. Mom, Dad, Miranda, Kevin, they all have their own hopes and dreams. Not to mention Lena, who's growing up so fast. But thanks to my stubbornness, I had to be the person in the spotlight, and now I've kept them from living up to their potential. I thought I was their savior. What if I'm actually their enemy? His thoughts were scattershot. Vague figures moved in front of him. He had never understood why some people were willing to sacrifice their lives for others, but now it was clear to him. For these people, the world wasn't as dark and hopeless as it had always seemed to him. These people loved the world, and the people in it very much. So even if it took putting their own lives on the line to save others, there was no question that they would make that choice. It was as simple as that. Was this also the reason people struggled on in the face of so much difficulty, rather than giving in as soon as things took a turn for the worse? Whichever way he looked at it, people were capable of more brilliance than he had been giving them credit for. What's with all these deep thoughts? He asked himself, smiling wryly. I sound like some kind of big-shot philosopher. Gradually, his vision cleared, and he came to a place that was both familiar and strange. In front of him, he saw an armored vehicle, some boxes of food, bottles of mineral water, and various other supplies. All at once, he recognized the place. It was the energy storage space. He tried to work out why it had looked so strange at first. I've never seen it like this before, he thought. I must have entered it at a different level. The ancient books spoke of this. Back in my old life, I didn't care if I lived or died, and I could easily break through the other levels because I could push myself to the brink of death to do so. Even when things started to improve with the cultivation practices, I was still so full of coldness and hatred. But I've been reborn, and for the first time, I have something to live for. That's why I've entered this space at a different level. Hope had entered his life, and it meant that his old way of looking at the world was no longer possible. He had finally broken through the gate of life and death. When he had struck out with his sword, it had been as though the weapon had had a life of its own. But whether it had been the sword or himself that had made the blow, it was clear that he was no longer determined to die. The reason that he hadn't hesitated to kill that monster at all costs was that, for once, he wanted to live. He opened his right hand, and a white light appeared in his palm. As he looked at it, his heart throbbed strangely. It felt that his very soul yearned for the light. Then he opened his left hand, which held a patch of darkness. Light and dark, life and death, he thought. Maybe I am a philosopher after all. His thoughts turned to his friends. I wonder how Miranda is. Alice, too. She only just reached the 4th level, but the powers she was using in the battle were close to the 6th. She must be exhausted. And what about the others? He left the energy storage space and opened his eyes to find Miranda at his bedside, as though she had been guarding him all this time. Their eyes met. You're alive, they both said at the same time. An awkward silence followed, and Charles asked, What happened? I thought you died. He sat up in bed, surprised to find her keeping watch over him. He knew that she would only be there if everyone else was okay. It wasn't that she didn't care about him, but that she wouldn't have wasted time at his side if the others were still in danger. She shook her head. It's Sylvia you should be worried about. She risked her life saving me. I would have died if it hadn't been for her." His heart sank. "How is she?" Could it be that Sylvia had seen the way that Alice had overspent her powers and had done the same to save everyone? Miranda's eyes were downcast. Forget it. If you have the time, go and see her yourself. Although I'm not sure if she really wants to see you right now." "I'm just glad she's alive," he replied. If she's alive, there's still hope. He could still feel the energies of life and death coursing through his body, and his mind eased. He asked, "How is everything else?" After the Hive Queen died, the bugs ran around like headless chickens. They became much easier to kill, especially with Kevin leading us. The next day, the military arrived with reinforcements. One of the soldiers, Lewis, led his men to clean up the rest of the crawlers. There were around 200,000 casualties in total, but it's over now. 3 days after the battle, Kevin brought us to a spring the Neils had discovered. "The water here is very good for your injuries." She smiled warmly. "Nina seems to have grown up so quickly. She volunteered to keep watch for any danger. Lots of people are supporting her." Charles was calmed by what Miranda had told him. She went on to explain that they had set up camp in a town near the healing spring. While he had been out of action, the others had carried on as usual. He was surprised to hear how Lena had risen to the occasion while he had been unconscious. According to Miranda, she was so busy taking on the responsibility of helping the others that she hadn't had much time to visit his bedside. He was more impressed than hurt to hear this. He asked, "Where's Alice? How is she?" She had deliberately avoided mentioning Alice. She looked like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the right words. His heart sank. What happened to her? She took a deep breath. "When you were unconscious, Alice used her water power to keep you alive. We should have told her to rest. She wouldn't stop until she knew you were safe. Then she passed out. When I went to check on her, I discovered that..." She stopped, not sure how to go on. "Take me to see her," Charles said. He was scared that she hadn't just overspent her powers, but her soul too. If that were the case, there would be no help for her. He wouldn't know what to do. He realized that while he had had plenty of experience putting his own life on the line, he couldn't bear the thought of any danger befalling his friends on his account. Miranda shook her head. "When we checked her, we found that her soul energy wasn't completely depleted. Her body was also intact. We couldn't touch her without being injured by her energy, but she's alive and okay. It's just that we can't wake her up." Charles was a little stunned. Then he remembered what had happened when Alice had first awakened. She hadn't been very strong. Most of the others in the school had been at the 5th level, while Alice had only been at the 1st. He had originally thought that she simply wasn't talented enough, and yet whenever she was in danger, she repeatedly used spells that had surpassed her rank. Normally, as other people's levels increased, their cultivation slowed. Even if they used medicinal crystal cores, there was only a certain number of these they could absorb each day. But Alice had been different. Her strength had steadily increased, and her powers had shown no signs of slowing even at the 4th level. Meanwhile, Sylvia, who had awakened not long ago before, was technically at a higher level than Alice. Charles had thought at first that she was more talented than Alice, but Alice later overtook her, even though she hadn't relied on the crystal cores. In other words, her skill level came entirely from her own body. Charles shook his head. "Looks like I was too focused on the dangers outside and wasn't paying attention to the people around me." He knew that he wasn't to blame, though. He had lived through 10 years of the apocalypse and had seen too much strangeness in the people around him to pay it much attention anymore. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back on his pillow as he tried to sort through the seemingly unrelated thoughts in his head. Alice awakened beside me. After I arrived at the school, Miranda, Calvin, and Dale all awakened too, and each managed to summon a Cerberus. In our small school, 3rd and 4th level monsters appeared frequently, like the lightning cadaver serpents. He paused to scratch his chin as he continued to parse his thoughts. Now, if each of these summons happened in isolation, we could chalk it up to simple coincidence. But since they were summoned together, it could be that something bigger was going on. Maybe this all means that I wasn't the target after all. Maybe it was someone close to me instead. If I'm correct, It means that the thing in Alice's body is most likely some gate of hell. It's one thing for it to be in there right now, but just think how dangerous it'll become when her power grows to its full potential. He let out a soft sigh. Whatever the case, I can't do anything about it right now. I'm too weak. I need to rest and recover, and then I'll be able to take on this gate of hell. That's my only way of saving Alice. And of course, we also need to establish the survival base. That's the most important thing. Once that's up and running, we'll have a base of operations to deal with everything else. Cheer up, said Miranda, mistaking Charles's reverie for despair. We can fix your arm. Apparently the military has the technology to create a mechanical one for you. It'll be even more useful than the original one. He opened his eyes in surprise, only now remembering that he had lost his arm when he had attempted that sword attack that was beyond his limits. Of course, he knew it was hardly an irreparable injury, not for someone with his powers. He had suffered worse in his previous life and had lived to tell the tale. And now with his renewed lust for life, he was stronger than ever before. Or at least he would be when his injuries healed. Don't worry, said Miranda. You saved us all, you know. It was incredible the way you faced down that monster in front of all the Alliance. People see you as their spiritual leader now. No matter your injuries, you'll always have their support. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Trust me, he said. I'm fine. Yes, she said. You will be. She thought that he was putting on a brave face to show off, and she didn't have the heart to discourage him. I can tell that the power of thunder has appeared in your body again. Even without your arm, you'll still have your elemental powers. But after what's happened, I don't think you should use the blood-drinking sword anymore. I can't give it back to you. You don't understand, said Charles. My arm can grow out. She stroked his forehead, thinking him sick and delirious. Of course it can, she said, humoring him. You'll be better in a month at most. Losing his arm was such a blow that he's completely lost touch with reality, she thought. Still, the army will have the mechanical arm completed in no time. Once they've fitted it, he'll recover quickly. He could tell that she didn't understand, and even if he spelled it out to her, she wouldn't believe him. She would think he had gone completely insane. It doesn't matter, he thought. When the arm grows back, that'll be all the explanation I need. He closed his eyes again, more tired than anything else. He was used to not being understood. Miranda sighed, thinking Charles felt dejected. I guess even someone as strong as him can be prone to moments of weakness. As she watched him lying there, she felt a tenderness toward him that surprised her. She leaned into him and kissed him deeply. When the members of the Alliance heard that Charles had woken up, they rushed to visit him. Anthony and the others went to the fortress to gather the students who were there, and then he and Olivia led them to Charles. They chattered among themselves on the way. The chief's awake. I knew it'd take more than that monster to take down someone like our boss. I heard he lost an arm in the fight. Is it true? Who cares? What's important is that he put his life on the line to save us. That's right. He sacrificed himself to protect us all. No matter his injuries, he's still our leader. Yeah, you'd better not be saying anything bad about him. You all saw how powerful that monster was. If it wasn't for Charles, we'd be bug food by now. We owe him our lives. If anyone says different, they can answer to me. Charles's sacrifice was all the evidence they needed that he had been a good person all along. His fight with the Hive Queen had moved everyone in the Alliance, raising his reputation to a level even higher than before. If anyone dared to say anything against him, they would have the entire Alliance to contend with. After the laws of society had crumbled, people's emotions were the principle that dictated who would be punished and who would be praised. This put Charles in the safest possible position, protected by the will and high opinion of all his followers. Lena, too, now enjoyed the high esteem of the Alliance. This was in part thanks to Charles's influence, but also because of how well she had fared in the battle. Charles had taught her how to detect danger of all kinds, and this sense was only enhanced by her dedication and growing powers. It meant that some even regarded her as the second most powerful person in the Alliance. Even so, she was a little weak after the battle. When she learned of Charles's recovery, she rushed to his side and collapsed in his arms, sobbing with relief. He laid his hand on her shoulder to console her. "I heard you fought well," he said. "You've come such a long way." She cried even harder. When Charles had fallen, she'd felt her whole world collapse with him. At the same time, she had known that if she had waited for him to wake up before carrying on the fight, this would only have disappointed him down the line. Instead, then, she had swallowed her grief and had taken on the responsibility of supporting everyone else through the battle. At every stage of the Alliance's migration from the fortress, she had stood at the front of the group and had faced danger head-on. Charles had taught her everything she needed to take on the leader role. Whenever she encountered monsters, no matter how fearsome and strange, she would quickly spot and exploit their weaknesses. She could even spot monsters lying in ambush and save people from their attack. Before the battle, everyone had just thought of her as Charles's kid sister, but afterward, she had shown herself to be a leader in her own right. She had carried on like this for several days, careful not to let her grief overcome her. It was only now that Charles had woken up that she gave in to her emotions. When she had calmed, she said firmly, "From now on, it's my turn to protect you. I'm more powerful than ever now. It was you who got me to this point. I won't let that go to waste." Her tears weren't a show of weakness. They were a way for her to release the pent-up stresses of the last few days. These days had taught her something. She now understood the pain of losing a loved one. The prospect of losing her brother had shown her the importance of those around her. She was determined to no longer depend on others to protect her, but to become that protector herself. Charles gave her a smile with a trace of sadness. "Okay," he said. "In the future, I'll rely on you to protect me." He noticed the dirt and grime on her clothes. She had worked so hard that she hadn't had a chance to wash or change them. Sadness and regret came over him to see her so exhausted. Given the choice, he would have given her a life free of conflict, but he didn't have that choice. All he could do was to make the most of this world where danger waited at every turn. She may only have been of high school age, but she would have to grow up, learn to survive, and bear responsibility. To see her already so far along that path left him proud and heartbroken in equal measure. This was the tragedy of this era. Even children were forced to make adult choices. One by one, the Alliance members visited Charles, saw that he would recover, and left. Each of them wished they could stay for longer at his side, but there was much to do in this new camp, and no time to linger. With Charles out of action, the Dawn Alliance was without a leader, and if the members didn't carry on with their work, the Alliance itself might fall apart. If it wasn't for the fact that Charles was still so weak and needed protection, even Miranda might not have been able to stay with him. After everyone finally left, Sergeant Greg Benning arrived with some other soldiers. "I'm told that the military has sent some troops to help us build a base here," said Charles. "I heard you've sent tents and someone skilled in farming. Thank you." It meant a lot to Charles that the Army had sent any extra resources at all to help the Dawn Alliance build a new home at such a difficult time. The fact they had specifically sent an expert in agriculture was particularly meaningful. Charles, who had experienced the future famine in his own timeline, knew the value of such a skill more than anybody. "As far as the Army is concerned," said Greg, "you aren't only the leader of the Dawn Alliance, but the protector of the fortress. More than that, you're the hero of the human race. Naturally, we'll do all we can to help somebody so committed to the protection of the people." At first, the military hadn't understood Charles's ruthless manner of doing things. Now that they had seen its results, though, they had come around to his style of leadership. In fact, Charles and Lewis's values had come to guide the military itself. They finally realized that in such desperate times as these, when the existence of humanity itself was on the line, they didn't have the luxury to show the same kindness and forgiveness as in peacetime. "We've brought the bodies of some of the insects for you to inspect," Greg continued. "Some of them are mutated. It seems that your power is connected to the insects in some way. We hope that if you can study them, we might learn more about the nature of that connection." Charles nodded. "You've been very helpful." His cultivation technique allowed him to refine any kind of matter, and the Hive Queen's corpse would help him to recover in the shortest time possible. Once he had recovered, he would turn his attention to Miranda. He hadn't forgotten that kiss. It seemed to him that she had taken advantage of his weakened state to tease him. More curious, though, was that since the kiss, her teasing hadn't led to anything more. He found it intolerable, the way she would move closer to him as though to taunt him, before backing away. He would bring it up with her if only he had more strength. Greg noted both Charles's smile and the bitter look in his eyes. He almost asked what was on his mind, but realizing this would be inappropriate, he kept silent. Finally, Charles came out of his reverie. He looked the sergeant directly in the eye and said, "Take me to the Hive Queen's corpse." Charles refined almost every part of the insects' corpses, including that of the Hive Queen. The only parts he left behind were those that would come in handy for creating and repairing weaponry. The energy from the corpses soon returned him partway to his peak strength. "I'll need even more energy to regrow my arm," he thought. "Even without the arm, though, I'll still be able to fight. I just won't be as skilled with my sword." Feeling his new strength, Charles chuckled to himself. He heard someone move in the corner of the room. "You," said a familiar voice. "Have you recovered yet?" It was Miranda, looking sheepish. She didn't know how she had been so bold as to kiss him at his bedside. Perhaps the unfamiliar environment and stress of the situation had magnified her feelings. After all, he had saved her twice now, and he had left a deep impression on her heart. It wasn't so unusual then that she had developed feelings for him. After the kiss, she had left and hadn't returned. This was the first time they had seen each other since. She watched him shyly as he approached her. "Recovered, you say?" He was so close to her that he had hardly needed to raise his voice. "And what about it?" Miranda's face turned red. "Nothing," she said. "I can see you're back on your feet, so naturally, you won't need me to look after you anymore." She turned to go, but he stepped closer to her again. "Yes, I'm back on my feet. What next?" "Next," she said, "we wait until you're fully recovered. Then we'll see." "We'll see. And what does that mean?" "It means we'll see." She stepped around him and left, and he smiled as he returned to his room. Since Charles had reached the 4th level, his ability to absorb energy had grown drastically. With the energy he had absorbed from the insects and his supply of medicinal crystal cores, he could feel his soul energy returning. He could also feel the ache in his heart diminishing. He grew so strong that at one point he decided to visit Alice. Just as he was leaving his room, though, he came across Miranda again. "You're not strong enough to see her," she said. "He's so young and impulsive," she thought. "Any visit he makes to her will only set his recovery further back." He was stunned to find Miranda once again in his way, but eventually he acquiesced and agreed to return to his bed and wait for his power to return. After absorbing one crystal core after another, his energy finally recovered, until one night, he realized he was strong enough to regrow his arm. Although the loss of the arm hadn't affected his strength as much as the depletion of his soul energy, he hardly wanted to live out the rest of his days as a one-armed hero. He had also judged that the Alliance's camp was safe for the time being, so he could afford to spend some extra energy in regrowing the arm. To prepare, he drank a bottle of water from the spring in the energy storage space. The liquid from the spring wasn't real water, but rather condensed energy. Combined with regular drinking water, it had the power to heal one's injuries. The essence water wouldn't repair his arm on its own, but it would give him sufficient energy to repair it himself. While he was using his mind to pour the essence water into the bottle, he spotted a long black snake coiled inside the energy storage space. "The lightning cadaver serpent," he thought. "What's it doing here?" He was surprised. When he had first entered the energy storage space a year ago, it had taken him a while to get used to the way that it worked, and he had struggled to properly see the things inside. But now that he had grown used to it, everything was much clearer. He moved closer to the lightning cadaver serpent. It was immobile, as though dead. His eyes lingered on it, and when he finally saw it breathing, relief washed over him. "It's only resting while it transforms," he thought. "Still, it gave me quite the fright. I thought it died in our battle against the Hive Queen." The serpent was crucial to his plans. He took this essence version of the serpent and laid it as a tattoo on his left arm. Once he had done so, he got the strange feeling that something about the serpent was different. Transferring it onto his body as a tattoo seemed to have given it a new sort of life, and yet at the same time, he couldn't shake his initial fear that it had died. "It's true," he thought. "The powers of life and death coexist together." Could it be that when I opened the gate of life and death, I created a connection between the serpent and my extract amulet? If so, then is the enemy's storage space now at a point when it can give life to the dead? He recalled what he had read in the ancient books, that the energy storage space was itself a real world, and as such, was capable of creating and sustaining life. This was a level of understanding he had never reached before. He had always thought that he would have to reach the saint level before he would fully comprehend the powers of life and death. But now he realized something. I've been thinking about it the wrong way around, he thought. It isn't that the saint level teaches you the understanding of life and death, but that reaching this understanding by yourself is what elevates you to the saint level. His mind cleared. He looked at the extract amulet and realized that he could now create special extract amulets. He had found the door to the saint level and had stepped through it. He was excited, and he had to breathe deeply to calm himself down. The abilities of the storage space and the powers of the extract amulet, I can explore these things later on, he thought. For now, the most important thing is repairing my arm. He looked at his empty right sleeve, which hung limp at his side. The absurdity made him laugh. He had been so caught up in his revelations that he had forgotten this most important thing. His soul energies soon began to gather, and before long, his body was filled with a new vitality. As the energy of life surged through his right shoulder, it brought an intense pain. He gritted his teeth and resolved not to make a sound. He focused all his energies on his shoulder until, before his eyes, his arm began to regrow, the cells regenerating at visible speed. First the bones and blood vessels, and then the muscles and skin.